Hello, I am Dr. Wes Boudville, founder of Linkit Corporation. This is the first in a series of videos, and this video will talk about the first four killer apps of the internet. Now, firstly, you all probably heard of the internet and the web, but a lot of people confuse the two things. They are not. The internet came first and was founded in 1969 at UCLA. The web, or the World Wide Web, was invented 20 years later in Europe and is responsible for the browsers and the websites. The 20 years separates them. And I'll jump a little bit ahead and tell you that the web is considered by some to be the third killer app of the internet. But then, what do I mean by killer app? App stands for application. It can mean a computer program. It's now sometimes these days the app is used to mean a computer program running on a mobile phone, like a mobile app. But in general, we can be talking about PCs or desktop machines, which are the same thing, and we could be talking about mobile phones. But firstly, after 1969, when the first internet connection was made, what was the first killer app? Well, the first killer app actually was what we would today call email. Although, if you probably went back in a time machine to 1975 and asked some of the people who were working at, say, UCLA or Stanford or MIT on these things and what they were working on, they might not even use the term email. It was not in common parlance in the mid-70s. And the electronic messaging that they used had some aspects that were quite different from today. But basically it was to send an electronic message from one computer to another, where the two computers are at different buildings, different cities even. And so the first killer app was what we would today call email. Now, the email addressing, at least today, you'd write it as something like you would email to Jill at some address. And the address might be like an internet address, like 10.20.30.45, for example. And that would be, but the problem was that real internet addresses were not like that simple, like 10.20.30.45. They might be 117.29.51.11. And it was a little bit of a pain to remember that if that was the address of somebody you were trying to send email to. And so the first killer app was electronic messaging, or I'm just going to say email. But then that immediately had a problem because the address of somebody, it was like basically a long phone number. And sometimes you didn't necessarily want to remember that. And there was a related problem. Back then, on the internet consisted of these computers which were called nodes, and the computer's connections to the internet might change address. That sometimes there was a lot of experimenting going on in those early years. And so the internet address of a particular node on the internet, like a node at MIT, for example, might have a different address next month because something went wrong or something was repaired or something had to be upgraded, and so the address might change. So it was hard enough remembering a given address of a given computer. It's even harder if that address would change. And besides, then there were practical situations like how exactly, if the address changed, how would you find out about it? Um, because if they could schedule it ahead of time, then the person whose computer's address was changing might perhaps send you an electronic message and say, hey, in that message, my computer will change address, and the message would then give the new address inside it, and then you'd have to write it down somewhere, and the next time you would send a message to this guy, you hopefully would write the new address, or you correctly. So the first, if the first killer app was electronic mail, what was the second killer app? That was domains or domain names, because if you had a friend Jill working at Hewlett Packard, do you really want to send um, an email to Jill at and then HP's current net address, which is a string of numbers, or it'd be nice just to send it to Jill at HP, or like a short abbreviation that you could remember, like HP, or as it came to pass, HP.com. And like that's why we had IBM.com or Cisco.com. So the second killer app of the internet was the domains, which is the names of the computers or the universities uh, that were running these internet nodes. And for example, for universities, you would have MIT.edu or UCLA.edu or Harvard.edu. So those two things, okay. And by the way, now this is an important point. All this has happened before 1989, before the web. So first thing is domains are older than the web. Well, for some domains, like UCLA's domain is much older than the web. Now that was now domains came along with just a few years after its electronic messaging, and then in 1989, in a Center for European Nuclear Research in Switzerland, this guy called Tim Berners-Lee invented this thing called World Wide Web, and it had two parts. It had HTML, which is the language of the web pages, and it had something strange called HTTP, which is the transmission mechanism across the internet of messages between a website and a program, which we now call a browser, which you would run on your machine, and it would go to some website. And so that the World Wide Web, all of it is the third killer app, all of it, which means like all the web pages, all those web domains, all of those collectively are the third killer app. And some people also think that you can make a good case for a fourth killer app of the internet, and that killer app is mobile phones. Because now mobile phones started in a different place. They did not depend on or use the internet at all. They ran on the completely separate hardware, the cell phones of the 1980s, which weighed like half a kilo, 500 grams, and they had nothing to do with the internet. But after 1989, going into the late 90s, like, as cell phones got smaller, they improved their performance, and then gradually they were hooked up so that I'll skip the technical details, but essentially they would use the internet. And then in the 2000s, with the smartphones that introduced by Apple in around 2007, that started this huge thing where the mobile phones became far easier to use, and with like a large flat screen, which was a touch screen, and the phones had GPS and cameras. So all of those things culminated in uh, essentially mobile phones converging with the internet to the extent that nowadays the um, some people might call the mobile phone the fourth killer app. Now this is this causes some confusion in terminology because now it's common on phones to refer to the programs running on phones as apps, as mobile apps. So to call the whole entire phone itself a killer app of the internet, you don't hear that much, frankly. But this is one way of looking at it if you take a broad enough view. And I've spoken enough, and this is the first of our videos. Thank you for listening, and keep an eye for the next one.